Open University. She received her PhD from the University of Bristol in 2015 and has held positions at Dickinson College and the University of Victoria, in addition to a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Calgary. She has published widely on Greek lyric poetry and most recently, pedagogical issues related to the reading of classical studies. Her book, Lyric Poetry and Social Identity in Archaic Greece, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2020. Today, Dr. Romney will join us in conversation about wine, song, and self. Please join Dr. Miller and I in welcoming Dr. Jessica Romney. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. So I'll just get this started. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about some research that came out of my book, out of my PhD dissertation, and so I'm going to be looking at how lyric poetry performed in the Symposium of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE helped define social groups for the Greek elite during this period, which is a very active period in Greek history. There we go. So in the book, I looked at how identity functions as a form of discursive performance in these poems. So we're looking at identity more as identification, as a thing that is done rather than an ownable thing. And when we look at identity as performance, we're looking at how it is embedded in the socio-historical context and the social institutions in which it is being performed. And for my project, this is entailing two things. First, we're looking at lyric poetry. And the authors that I looked at are there on the screen with their rough dates. We're looking at lyric poetry both as poetic language and as social communication. And second, when we look at it as communication, we're looking at it as communication that takes place within the Symposium, the elite drinking feast of the Archaic period. And this means that lyric poetry is going to be engaging fully with the norms, speaking conventions and values of the Symposium, regardless of whether we're talking about elegy, iambus, lyric, or whatever content type we might have within those metrical genres. Now, for the ancient world, when we talk about identity, we basically mean group identities. And there are two big reasons for this. The first is that it's very likely that the idea of identity is something personal, internal, and ownable, right? Something like you would see in a self-help book. This idea of identity as personal and distinct from society around us is a product of the post-Protestant Reformation European world, and certainly the post-French Revolution European and North American world. Second, in ancient Greece, identities are often framed within the context of larger groups. So for example, you are Athenian, not because you are born to the polis or the region of Athens, but because you are born to Athenians and you are part of the larger Athenian group, you are recognized by it, you participate in its rituals, and so forth. So identities are always within a larger group context, and this is particularly apparent when we look at bad actors who are bad because they are portrayed or accused of operating as individuals. So they're separate from their groups. So today I'm going to briefly run through some of the identity work that we see in archaic lyric, focusing on these 5 basic rhetorical strategies for groupness that I go through in chapter 1 of the book. Now, these strategies do 2 things. So the first is that on the whole, they seek to make the values and behaviors that define a particular group salient to the audience. Now, the more that the audience identifies and connects with particular values, norms, and behaviors that are associated with a certain identity, the more they will then identify with that group and identity. This process is known as depersonalization. and it seeks to persuade individual group members to see themselves more as an exemplar of the ideal group, that is to identify with the group first, than as a biographical individual and to identify with the self first. So that's the first thing they do. The second thing these strategies to groupness do is they contribute to the definition of the audience and the audience plus poet as a group by imposing we identities on the poet and audience, by appellating the audience as a collective you or as a friend to the poet, or they set the audience as in group with the poet against an outgroup. So I'm going to quickly go through the context for the symposium, and then we will hit each of these strategies, and we will look at some of the poems really quickly. Okay. So the symposium was a central social institution for archaic Greek elite men, if not the central social institution. We have a representation of the symposium on this screen from the Tomb of the Diver. And in form, as you can see, it involves groups of men reclining two to a couch, and they would recline in a rough circle around the wine crater, which is pictured to the right of the screen. So the symposium is gathered nightly to consume wine, socialize, discuss politics, educate new members, and entertain themselves through the performance of poetry, riddle games, and games of skill. Now, as the display of cultural capital through these performances was a key part of the performance of elite status, the symposium stands as the central site for the performance and maintenance of the elite group in the archaic period. It's also the likely venue where new members to the elite group, either those who marry up or young men who are being socialized how to behave as adults, this is where they would learn those manners. So because of this, the symposium is vital to the continuation of the elite group in the archaic period. It is more than just an occasion to drink and to show off one's wit. Okay. All right, so if the symposium served as the venue for the performance of elite status, then Sympotic poetry is also performing in that display via these rhetorical strategies. So Sympotic poetry showcases the cultural capital that each performer had, while it also whispers, even shouts, the values and behaviors that define various group identities seen in Sympotic poetry. So it is in lyric verse that poet and audience are negotiating their shared identity, for poets are embedding in their poems the discourses and values aimed to shape the social identities held by the audience. Now, these are the 5 strategies as on the screen: fiction of sameness, audience addresses, commands, shared history, and outgroups. And they're listed in relative order of popularity, with the fiction of sameness as the most popular, in part because it also shows up with all of the other ones. So these strategies often overlap. They work together, they're not distinct. Okay, so sameness denotes the property of shared characteristics or qualities which enable one member of the group to assert that we are all the same. And this ability to claim inherent similarity with others forms part of the basic process of identification. Identity is relational, and it is defined in respect to positive and negative others. So those who are similar, those who are not similar. Now, sameness is particularly salient for groupness because this form of identification creates and enforces ties amongst group members that support group cohesion and the shared identity of the group. Now, in Sympotic lyric, the fiction of sameness that often appears is in the assumption that audience and poet hold the same values, goals, expectations, whatever. And this will be seen in just bland assumptions about value statements, standards regarding praise and blame, and in the description of a we group linking poet and audience through the first person plural pronoun. We also will see this in didactic tone poems, where the values are stated through the lesson that everybody is expected to agree with. So we have, as an example, the poem from MacEwan that says, Once again then, let us no longer practice such Scythian-style drinking with clatter and shouts alongside the wine. Rather, let's drink moderately amid noble hymns. So the exhortation is an exhortation that includes the poet and the audience. It collectively addresses them as a we group, right, where they are all engaging in the same behavior. They are all agreeing with the poet that they're going to drink in a moderate fashion, right, opposite to this other fashion of drinking that's been called Scythian. And so as the audience behaves in the way exhorted, they are showing that they are adopting the same behavior, the same values that the poet is expressing in this poem, even as they're all drinking together and reinforcing the event, their groupness based on that event and their shared identity. So the next most common strategy are audience addresses. So the use of titles or names elaborates on an address to an individual or group that is just like a basic hey you there. So because of this, addresses of all forms, whether you addresses names or titles, they all operate in the same basic way. And addresses create a relationship between speaker and addressee that for this corpus is usually positive. There are some negative ones, and I'm going to talk about them with the outgroups. Now, the imposition of a relationship often asserts, the use of an address often asserts a positive personal relationship. And then this is qualified by the use of names or titles such as friend, companion. When we have singular addresses, because the space of the symposium is so small, they are only notionally singular. And so when an individual is addressed, the full audience participates in that notionally private address. They do so either by identifying with the addressee as a kind of collective addressee, or by breaking into groups that some identify with the poet, others with the addressee. And we see this quite a bit with didactic poetry. Plural addresses, on the other hand, create a linguistic group of speaker plus addressees that maps onto the performer and the audience, where the audience become a collective group vis-a-vis the poet. And the poet is often in a kind of hierarchical position above the addressees. So for example, we have one of those didactic poems where Theognis says, "Whoever with a single tongue has a twofold nose, that one is a terrible heteros, Kernus, better an enemy than a friend." So this is one of the many poems out of Theognis's corpus advising who to keep company with, right? It's advice on who a good heteros, trusted companion, it's somebody who's with you through the thick and thin is. And it predicates on having a single-fold nous, or cognitive mind, like capacities of the mind. So somebody who says what they mean, right, says what they're thinking. And by addressing Kernus, Theognis is creating a didactic relationship between his speaking character as an older man and this younger man addressed as Kernus. Right? There's a whole series of poems addressed to Kernus that build this relationship in the Theognidian corpus. And the audience here, right, sees this relationship being performed, nods along with this advice to have as a friend, somebody who says what they're thinking. And anyone who's learning these values would be invited to participate as Kernus, while those who could give this advice with Theognis are invited to participate in the relationship on that side of things. Okay, so with addresses, we often have commands. So we see three types of commands. First person plural, so let us not shame as in LKS. Second person singular or plural, so cross the deck, or Kilkis. And then third person singular, let each throw with Colinus. Now commands accomplish two basic things. So first, they urge the adoption of values and behaviors associated with the social identity that is being proposed by the poet, and thus also the adoption of the identity itself. They also reinforce the cohesion of the group by imagining itself in the future. So this is the second thing they do. They are forward-thinking strategies, imposing group ties on the future of the individuals addressed. Now, this future mindset imposed by commands helps to foster a sense of continuity and immutability for the group, while the behavior of the command then links that immutability to the social identity implicated. And this is important because while social identities will claim to be constant and consistent throughout time, they are actually quite fragile and precarious as they depend on the social sort of institutions and events that are going on. So by kind of being able to push themselves into the future, commands help secure the strength of a particular identity. So we're going to look at a poem that is a bit longer from Tyrtaeus, which gives us each of the three types. So the commands are underlined. So he says, "Let us fight for this land with spirit and let us die for our children, no longer sparing our lives. But you, Neoi," this is a class of young soldiers, "fight, remaining alongside one another. And do not begin shameful flight nor fear, but make the spirit big and bold in your breast. And do not love life when you fight men." Then he continues on and says, "But let each man stand strong and remain with both feet fixed on the earth, biting his lip with his teeth." So the poet proceeds through three different levels here, right? He starts with the "let us fight and let us die," as he gives the audience a panoptic view of the Sympotic group. And he includes himself in these commands and the identity of stalwart fighters who are defending their land, who are standing strong. And it's notable that he includes himself in the most dangerous part of the command, right? "Let us fight, let us die." And this is to fold the audience into his perspective by appellating them as a we with him, but also to sort of mitigate some of the perceived danger. He then quickly moves to a you command, addressing a segment of the audience as Neoi, and then directing them in particular to fight in a particular way and adopt these values of standing in place and shunning fear. So that gives the audience his view of them as a group opposite him. And then he moves to the individual perspective, right? When he says, "Let each man stand." So again, this is reinforcing that sort of stationary martial position of hoplite fighting. But here, this generic "let each man" applies to every single individual as they're sort of individually being addressed at everyone at the same time. So yeah, the command structure here reinforces that identity of the stationary stalwart hoplite soldier by giving the audience three different perspectives and three different types of commands. Okay. With shared histories, these can be mythic, like going back to sort of foundation stories. They can be occasional, they can be very brief, or they can be quite lengthy. We have a broad range here. But what the narration of the shared history does is it can be an exercise in reshaping the group's communal memory so that the past supports the present. The narrative given will reimagine the past and repeat it in a fashion that will be most relevant to the current purpose that the words are directed at and for the group's cohesion. Where we get a we group whose narrated history will give the group depth, while it also will provide itself as a possession that everyone shares and is thus reinforcing the sameness of the Sympotic group. So we also have it retrojecting that proposed sameness into the past. So like with the commands that push identity into the future, by pushing identity into the past, we also kind of reinforce that fiction of stability and constantness. So from Malchus, we have a brief mention of a shared history as he says, "These things are impossible to forget since the very beginning when we undertook this action here." Now, the poet has just previous to this gone through a lengthy list of all of this different types of armor that's gracing a banquet room. And what we seem to have here is a momentary lull in fighting, particularly stasis or civil strife. And so the poet is reminding his audience of their past engagement in civil strife and their continued promises to fight and to aim for political power. So this shared history, right, is reinforcing this need to fight, to remember, and to keep going. It's quite elliptical, and a lot of the shared histories that have survived complete are in this sort of a short elliptical fashion. Okay, the last strategy is outgroups. So outgroups oppose the group of similars with whom an individual identifies. And outgroups exist on an oppositional spectrum from not us but okay to not us and major threat. And the use of outgroups is to help persuade a poet's audience to identify with the poet's group identity on offer, because the outgroup embodies the opposite of what the in-group, the poet's group, is supposed to stand for. And outgroups can also be used to pose a threat, whether specific or general, to the audience. Now, most in-groups in Sympotic lyric appear implicitly. That may be because this is a fragmentary corpus of literature and we just don't have the second half of the contrast. But the other reason may be because of the symposium itself. Individual symposia construct an ideal alternate world for their participants through the ritualized separation of Sympotic space and activities from the real world of the polis. So outgroups exist outside of this alternative space, and they are part of the real world that symposia are designed to overlook. So admitting an outgroup into the poetic space of the symposium introduces the social reality which the symposium is trying to forget. So that's one of the reasons why we may not have too many of them. And also, it may also explain why when we do have explicit oppositions between in and out groups, the contrast is primarily made in terms of Sympotic values and practices. So for example, from Solon's corpus, we have, "You there, quiet the strong heart in your breast, you who have reached the limit of good things, and set your great nose into moderation. For we will not suffer it, nor will these things be sufficient for you." So Solon here is dividing the you group from the we group in terms of the group's nose, the mind and its ability to understand and its capacity to reason. And the you group has a nose that does not understand moderation. The we group does. And this is building on a discourse of moderation that goes throughout the Symposium and Sympotic literature, where moderation is consuming as much as is suitable for you and your particular group. So this is consuming wine, food, consuming wealth, anything you want. So the we group knows moderation. The you group does not. And this is why they're being censored. And they're being told also that if they continue in the way they're going, that hostilities will break out over this lack of moderation. This then sends notice to Solon's audience that they better continue to recognize moderation, because to not be able to do that gets them kicked out of his group. So outgroups both create cohesion by posing a threat through the form of the outgroup, but they also create cohesion by reminding the audience that if they don't toe the line, they can lose group membership. All right, so where do we go from here? Archaic lyric is a poetic form of social communication, but it's also a literary enterprise. So lyric engages with the social and historical life of its performance communities while doing so in meter and poetic dialects. So it engages with all of its communities, the literary and the social. And I'm going to show you a quick animation while, there we go, going through this. So I'd like to end quickly with an end from the book. Performed alongside the consumption of wine, Sympotic poetry turned language into a cultural commodity to be produced, performed, and orally ingested. The performance was communication in and of itself. For symposiums announced their elite status to all involved, giving evidence to their claim by the poetry and cultural capital they owned, by the wine they could provide and consume decorously. As wine passed from one symposius to another, so too would each offer his own piece of poetry or speech in return for those he had just heard. Reciprocity in everything, and Sympotic poetry stood as just one part in the all-encompassing world of philia and xenia, the reciprocal friendships between elite men. All involved in Sympotic performances declared elite status for themselves and groupness with one another. All who shared song shared in turn a social identity, perhaps also a political and martial identity. Sympotic lyric lived and breathed in the elite communities of the Archaic period, and it continued to do so via reperformance in the classical period and beyond. In addition to providing educational material, witty conversation, and political persuasion, Sympotic lyric gave its audiences a mirror of themselves as they wanted to be now and in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica, for that great talk. Yeah, I mean, it's so rich and so many things to think about. I was, to begin, I'm so impressed. And I've heard you speak on this topic before, and I'm lucky enough to have a copy of your book beside me. But I'm so impressed by your ability to get at a process like identification in what is this sort of frozen corpus of poetry. Like lyric poetry. So it's so difficult to get behind the rhetoric. And not only have you got behind the rhetoric, you've outlined what the rhetoric was for us. And I think that's incredible. And to do it within the corpus of fragmentary poetry from the Archaic period. And for those of you who aren't readers of Greek, written also in a slew of different dialects, surviving in papyrus fragments and scattered across manuscripts, and just incredibly difficult to work with. Is all the more impressive. So thanks so much for sharing this with us, and thanks for making it, giving it to us in this sort of packaged and really comprehensible manner. So I really appreciate it, and I'm sure I speak for the audience as well. While we wait for audience members to think of their questions, and I'll remind everyone that there's a Q&A button at the bottom. So please add your questions to the bottom, and we'll get to them in a minute. I might ask a couple of questions to get things started. And if it's okay with you, Jessica, I'll start with something that starts at the beginning of your talk and kind of chronologically at the beginning too. And this is just a broad question. So you're dealing with Archaic lyric poetry, roughly from your 700s to the 500s BC or something like that. Yeah. Do you see this sort of rhetoric of elite identity and sameness and all the strategies you have? Is this special to the Archaic period and Archaic lyric, or is it something that you imagine existed before, but we may or may not have the evidence for it?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are some strategies and ways of defining groups that we see. So, for example, in the martial poems, there's a lot of parallel between them and the Homeric epics. But whether that's coming out of the same time period as the Archaic lyric, or it's from the earlier substrata of the Homeric epics, that's more difficult to tell. So yeah, getting at the earlier stuff is difficult. On the other side of things, though, some of these strategies do get picked up by other genres of literature, and in Athens in particular, they get broadened out, and they no longer are solely elite identity strategies, but they're kind of co-opted by the demos and democratic identity rhetoric. So, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we had these earlier because they are very transferable strategies.
Maybe I can ask a follow-up, because it's the sort of other question that had occurred to me right away when you started your talk was, is poetry kind of special in this regard with these kind of this sort of rhetoric? I mean, again, I'm aware, of course, it's the evidence you have for the archaic period is basically that, but maybe I'm asking you to speculate. I mean, do you think that these sort of rhetorics are being used outside of the poetic mode, and it just happens that's what we have the evidence for? Or do you think poetry is really special in this regard in the archaic period?
Yeah, I think poetry is special, right? It's I mean, it is kind of remarkable that our earliest literature out of ancient Greece is poetry, right? We don't have prose until the classical period. And prose does a lot of work to be like, we're just as important as poetry, right? So there is a status to poetic language that, yeah, does make it distinct from other genres. And I think part of it is because it's difficult, right? Like, you know, you mentioned the dialects. Also, when you look at the lyric meters of Alcaeus, and I didn't look at Sappho's poetry because that's not in the Symposium, but like Sappho's meters, they're incredibly complicated. So, you know, being able to present material in poetic verse, right? You're saying, look, I took time to get to this point. This is an important message. You need to listen to it. I'm also an important person. You should listen to me. So I think, yeah, there's a status to poetry, both from the sort of education you need to be able to perform this stuff, but also there's just a kind of cultural view that poetic language is more important than everyday prose.
It's interesting. You might find you might think of a parallel, right, with the way the classics itself and you know, the ability to read classical text has been used as the creation of an in-group identity versus out-group identity, and that's sort of mirroring the way that it was used itself in antiquity. It's sort of kind of hard to puzzle out. Thank you, Ruth. Do you want to either ask a question, or should we launch into the Q&A from the audience, as you wish?
If you want to launch for now, and I'll save something to the end unless somebody already asked it.
Sure. Okay. And I'll get to the other 65 questions I have written down. So we go. There's so much to digest. But let's turn to our audience members. So Jessica and I can see the questions, but I'll read them out so that everyone can hear them. So this first question comes from Christian Lehman. Is shared history limited by actual time or participation, or does it give space to an imaginary participation? Are people only sharing that history who were present at the time and at the event? Or does it create an imagined participation where anyone, anywhere, or time can imagine themselves as part of the community?
Wow, that's it's a good question. There's a lot in there. So short answer is kind of yes to all of those, right? We see shared histories used in different ways. So in the longer bit of Tyrtaeus that I read out, he has a comment, right, that says, let us no longer spare our lives. And this suggests that the us group was together at a time when they were more cautious in their willingness to go out and die. And that is anyone who's in the audience, right? That is a putative history that is really not limited by time. It's really just encompassing whoever happens to be there. On the other hand, we have treatments like in, so Alcaeus 129 is a fragment where he narrates the breaking of an oath by Pittacus, who's the tyrant of Mytilene. And Pittacus used to be in the same sort of group as Alcaeus and his comrades. And they were all going to go out and fight against the previous tyrant Mytilene. And then Pittacus broke the oath and went over and joined the tyrant's side and then became tyrant. So 129 goes through this history and it re-performs the oath as Alcaeus narrates it. But the way he narrates it prevents Pittacus from participating in the oath. And so this rewrites history, right? It says Pittacus never really took that oath, so the oath has never been broken. We don't need to fear the wrath of the gods, only Pittacus needs to fear the wrath of the gods. And there, it is limited by time, right? Because this is a specific event that's being reimagined. But the way, at least there's a chunk missing in the middle, unfortunately. But the way the existing words suggest things go, it's not just limited to those who were there. So long as it doesn't involve Pittacus, anyone listening to Alcaeus can participate in that. So we get a range of different uses of shared history.
There's always a chunk missing, right? That's
always a chunk missing.
Yeah. Maybe I could just indulge a follow-up. Like, I mean, does this? What do you think these rhetorics and I think I'm building on Christian's question. What about the role of reperformance and sort of role play? I mean, how are these same rhetorics of sameness and identity that you've discussed here, are they still in operation when these poems are reperformed far away from their original contexts?
Yeah, I think some of them definitely are. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why these poems survive, right, is because there's a reason to reperform them. So things like Theognis's lessons on how to behave, those are obvious why they're being reperformed. They're teaching values that continue to be important. And same with Tyrtaeus's poetry. With Alcaeus, right, it's very specific to what his group is going through, the fight against the Mytilenean tyrants. But we're told it got reperformed in Athens under the Pisistratids because the Athenian elite were like, oh, we're playing Alcaeus. We're not, trying to protest against the tyrants. And so there, that opportunity to take on a character, reperform these earlier poems, serves the same ultimate function of cohering a group around a shared task. So yeah, we do see the continuation of these strategies for reperformance.
Great, thank you very much. Our next question is from, in fact, our last speaker in this series, Dr. Carolyn Willikas from Mount Royal University. Is there any evidence for the Symposium group experience taking on a sort of alternate reality? She recollects us vaguely, she says, a story about a symposium where the participants decided or believed they were all sailors on a ship in a storm and embraced this reality in a rather enthusiastic way. How does this relate to group ID? Is there a form of role playing, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, so the story that Carolyn is referring to is a Sicilian symposium, which had a group of young men who were playing at being sailors and then got so drunk that they thought they were actually sailors and that their ship was sinking. And so they tossed all of their furniture out of their windows and then were brought up on charges for disturbing the peace the next day. So we definitely see this, and the sailor, the ship theme is very popular. So the command from Archilochus I had was to cross the ship. It's actually one of these sort of faux sailing poems where he talks about how there are waves, but just cross the ship and draw off line. Nobody's going to stay sober on this watch, which if you were actually sailing is a bad idea, right? So yeah, we have alternative reality. Again, ships are kind of very popular. Archilochus also has other poems referring to being drunk on watch. So there are some, and they tend to be group actions, right? So again, we're reinforcing the cohesion of the group. And Tyrtaeus's poems too are actually in this because they are not battlefield addresses for all that they sound like they are battlefield addresses. So the kind of participation in group action, whether it's in the symposium or in an imagined situation, is again just reinforcing that group cohesion, group action aspect.
Great, thank you. So our next question comes from anonymous attendee. Which Greek dialects are most prominent in Sympotic lyric?
Yeah, so Ionic Greek is the most common, as it's the dialect for iambus and elegy, which are two largest genres of existing lyric. For the lyric meters, Sappho and Alcaeus are in lesbian Aeolic Greek. So they constitute a very small dialect group, but it's a very prominent one because of the number of their verses that have survived.
Yeah, and like we said, that's one of the challenges of working with this material, I guess, is these sort of minute dialect groups and little contemporary evidence or other evidence that comes out of these. We have another anonymous attendee. They're also autonomous, I guess, who asks a question. I have a question about group membership and what constituted some common themes in this poetry. Can you talk about references to symposiasts' bodies, especially anything that might be considered a disability?
Oh, that's a good question. So we are told that in Alcaeus's poetry, he called Pittacus clubfoot and chapfoot, and a few other references to his feet. And just trying to think what else there is. Nothing else is really coming to mind. That being said, for like, I guess, gestures and physical behavior in the symposium, when we are told about the games and the feats of skill, it's not just that you can do the thing that's being tested, you're also being judged on how, I guess, how elegantly you do it. So one of the major games was the cottabus, where you would rest the cup on the heel of your hand and you flick like the must of the wine at a target. And so those who hit the center of the target obviously are at the top, but amongst those groups, it's whoever has the most elegant throw. So there is an aesthetics to bodily performance that's going on in the symposium. Like I said, there's very few references that to actual bodily impairment or disabilities. But there is a definite thing there going on with physical perfection and elegance.
The only other one that comes to my mind, Jessica, which I know you know about, is that Archilochus one with the good general, who's like, I don't want the beautiful guy, I want, and I think the word is, I just happened to be looking at it the other day, it's the only reason it's in my head. I think it's Roikos. It's the same word that Thersites is described as in the Iliad, this sort of.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's, and there it's definitely going, Archilochus is definitely going against elite sensibilities with this privileging of the idea of the kaloi kagathoi, right? Those who are good because they are beautiful. And yeah.
Do you see that in the rhetoric of sameness and group identity, that there is a call for the sort of beautiful thing? Is there anything more to be said about that we're all beautiful as well? Does that come up? Thinking of bodies?
It does in Theognis, in the sense that he's using those loaded terms of agathoi and kaloi. But kalos at this period still has a moral component that is equivalent to the aesthetic component. So it's unclear how much physical beauty is being stressed there versus the kind of like inner morality as based on birth. But he's also giving us like the early eugenics with the thing about like, we have all these breeding lines with animals, why don't we have them with humans and have elites marry elites and non-elites marry non-elites? So, there might be something there with him.
And like you say, that aesthetics of the aesthetics and morality being equivalent is obviously, it's part of this. So there's obviously more to be discussed there, I guess. Yeah. So our next question comes from Natalie Swain, who I think I saw just a moment had to leave. One of your fellow University of Bristol student graduate. Thank you so much for this presentation, Jessica. Jessica, was fascinating. I'm curious to know if or how you feel these elements impacted Hellenistic poets, specifically Callimachus and his focus on the private. Was it a response to this kind of elite rhetoric?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, so my suspicion with Callimachus and his focus on the private is more the development of elite rhetoric as it gets developed in the classical period, particularly in Athens. So in Athens, you know, with the rise of sort of the radical democracy, elite rhetoric shifts to where elites are focusing more on private things to show a lack of concern for the public so that they don't get accused of being tyrants. And the sort of private displays of wealth and all of that become very problematic in Athens for most of the 5th century. And so with this sort of focus on private life and, you know, the more internal aspects that we see in Hellenistic literature, it's coming out of that world in Athens. I think more so than what we're seeing in the Symposium. Because when we see like political rhetoric and Sympotic lyric with Alcaeus and with Solon and even with Theognis, it's public facing, right? It's addressed at the community. It's addressed in defense of the community. So it's very different than what we're seeing in Athens in the classical period, where the elite are taking on the voice of the community and trying to minimize their kind of perceived elite status.
I think maybe I'll just move to skip one question. We'll come back to it, but I think a question from my colleague, Dr. Melissa Funke here, maybe sort of carries on this theme. Thanks for your talk, Jessica. I know this is heading beyond the scope of this talk, but do you find resonances of inclusion, exclusion you identify in archaic poetry in the classical period or in Sympotic literature from later periods?
Yeah. So inclusion, exclusions, like the basic thing of group identities, and so a lot of these strategies do continue, but like I said, they appear in mostly other genres. So in Athenian rhetoric and like for a political oratory, the way the orators use a lot of these address strategies, kind of commands to behave in ways, like, so they'll address the Athenian audience as jurors, and you'll remind them of all of these great Athenian values that define the city, and then they'll say, now make your judgment in accordance with all of these values. And that's very similar to what we see in like say Tyrtaeus, when he goes through all of the different martial values and he says, now go out and fight in this prescribed way. Now, later Sympotic literature is a thorny subject. In Athens, symposia change in the classical period because they're one of the institutions that broadens out and becomes part of larger democratic culture. So we see public rooms that people can rent. We see cheaper versions of the fine pottery for sale for a wider economic distribution. And there seems to be a split between symposia, so that elite symposia may be more over the top, and we end up getting komoi, those processions, the drunken processions, which everybody hates and became a problem. And these sort of more extravagant symposia became a way of, defining elites versus kind of, I guess, more regular symposia that have been adopted by other people. And it's also in this period that, at the end of the classical period, that the Macedonian banquets sort of take over. And Mark Fikowski has argued that we see the end of the Symposium by the end of the classical period. We don't have a lot of literature from these Attic symposia, which is shocking considering all of the other Attic literature we have from this period. So it's unclear whether a la Plato and Xenophon, everyone's engaging in philosophical discussions, or they're just re-performing bits of Pindar or Solon or what. But there's a definite Sympotic shift in Athens, and it's difficult to see because we just don't see how the literature changed with it because we don't have the poems that were performed in it.
Right. Once again,
Sorry, that's a long answer.
We're always at the mercy of this sort of fragmentary evidence in every aspect of classical antiquity, of course.
Yeah.
Our next question is from Flavia Amaral from the University of Toronto. Thanks, Jessica. A very insightful talk and precious readings of archaic lyric. You mentioned titles that are addressed apart from names, and she was wondering what these titles are and if they themselves are subdivisions of the selves represented in the symposium.
Yeah, so we see a range. So we have the address to people as friend, as philos or heteros, or as trusted friend, so philos heteros. We have addresses to, so neoi is a common address in martial lyric, young men. We have the pais, and in Alcaeus, the aitas address. Aitas seems to be a lesbian Aeolic equivalent of pais, but it only ever occurs in Alcaeus. So, and those addresses are a little difficult because they're either referring to young elite men as objects of desire, or they're referring to free young men who are serving as wine pourers, or they're addressed to slaves, male slaves of any age who are serving as wine pourers. So in some cases, it's really easy to tell when we've got an erotic address, because it's usually along the lines of, why don't you look at me anymore, boy? You know, I love you so much and you just scorn me. So those are pretty easy to tell. And they're, yeah, that sort of homoerotic elite bonding of the symposium is being performed. The addresses to slaves or to wine pourers are sort of usually to reinforce the purpose of the group as being there to drink and to work to do this together. Yeah.
And our next question, I'm guessing this is the same anonymous attendee as before. A follow-up, read the disability question. Does choliambic verse feature into your arguments?
Not in the sense of the sort of limping iamb tradition that we see with choliambic and also with elegy that comes out of later periods. We don't quite have those at this period, at least as far as we can tell, based on the sources. Different meters aren't being talked about as having specific characteristics. That is a later thing that's coming out of scholarly and literary criticism traditions in Greece and Rome. In this period, when we see different meters being used, it's to give a tone. So elegy, the elegiac meter usually gives a kind of sedate, moralistic tone, whereas the iambic meters will, and we usually see these in the trimeters and tetrameters. Iambic meters will usually allow more abusive, more immediate language, but that's about as much as we see. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting point. Our next question is from Sylvia Mellot. Considering the unity amongst the symposium's members and the fact that they were elite men in Greek society, would the Sympotic teachings of moderation and balance influence other aspects of society, such as the function of the polis or class hierarchy and so on?
Yeah, they are presented as such. So it's difficult to tell because these fragmentary poems are really our only written sources aside from Homer until we get to the classical period, which is part of the fun, studying the archaic period. But they are certainly presented as if Sympotic moderation and balance is the equivalent of political moderation and balance. And we see this particularly in Solon's poetry. So in Solon 4, his poem on eunomia, or good order, right, he says that the city is being destroyed by the citizens and the leaders of the demos as they do not know how to enjoy harmony at a feast. So the implication is that they are riotous, they overeat, they overdrink, they leave a mess everywhere. And as they poorly perform, or as they poorly manage a feast, so they are also poorly managing the polis. And on the other side of things, Solon and his group are having this lovely, leisurely political theory, moderate symposium, which then suggests that they would run a lovely, moderate, leisurely city. So political rhetoric in Sympotic lyric definitely equates the two. Whether or not that was actually the case.
So class hierarchy sort of brings to mind a question that I had during your talk. You mentioned the symposium, you know, as a, well, in a sort of didactic element, right? That it would be a locale where new members of the elite, either young men who've grown up, or I guess people who have joined this group, could somehow could learn how to operate. So I just wondered, what do you make of? I mean, it's a huge question with totally different contexts. I get it, but what about social mobility then in this period? So are we to imagine that people could kind of work themselves up into become part of this elite group that's in the symposium, or do you think it's more of an exchange between elite groups?
It's a bit of both. Right? That's just always the answer. So for people moving up, this is where Theognis and all of his complaints are really quite useful. And I'm pulling on arguments from Bukowski's Rise of the Aristocratic Banquet and Alain Dupuis' Prestige des Élites, where they argue that elite status in the archaic period is performative, and you know, it's not a legal status, right? So across the Greek world, there are different ideas of what it means to be an agathos, an elite, but the consistent thing is it's not legal. It's not, you know, based on law. Instead, it's based on acceptance by other members of the agathos group, of the elite group, and by performances opposite the larger community, right? So these are things like dedications, temple building, all of those grand elite gestures. And in performances towards other elites, right? If you live like an agathos, talk like one, behave like one, if you have the economic stability to maintain those performances, then you will be accepted as such. So in periods of economic change and growth, this means that those who are at the top of the non-elite group can move up. And this is where Theognis's complaints about kakoi, non-elites, becoming agathoi, elites, come out of, right? That people are moving up and they're being accepted as elites because they are adopting the lifestyle. They're learning how to behave in an elite manner. So we've probably got something that's similar to the movement of the Nouveau Riche in the Victorian period. And if we take Theognis as representative of at least one group, it wasn't a change that was altogether welcomed. But it would have been one that was necessary, because if people can move up, that also means that people can move down. And that's where a lot of the fear in the Theognodia comes from. But of course, this would have been different between cities. So within a city with the social classes moving around, we also have kind of horizontal relationships around the Greek world, where ideas of what it means to be elite are being shared.
It makes me think also the old oligarch sort of complaints about democratic Athens. I mean, to move a different period. I know. Our next question is from Lauren Scott. Do you think that the use of poetry during the symposia allowed for the preservation of this poetry?
Yeah. So these poems, from what we can tell, weren't written down until sometimes much later. Now, the only body of Sympotic lyric that has a manuscript tradition is Theognis. Everything else is quoted or on papyri. And so, yes, to get it from the 7th or 6th century to the first time it was written down until when it was in the form that we get it, it would have been through memory, through the performance of poetry at symposia and people remembering and continuing on. One of Theognis's poems, says, "Sit next to noble men and learn how to speak noble things," right? And this is the sense, you learn how to speak, but you also learn what to say, right? So it is in the continuation of this poetry that it is preserved.
On that sort of note, do we find, or are there examples of like these poets using like some part of their poetry to get their name into? Like, I mean, they wouldn't want to be forgotten. Are there sort of parts of the poetry that speak to that?
Yeah, so Theognis has the seal elegy where he goes through an address to Cernus and says, "These shall be a seal on my words." And people will say, these are the words of Theognis of Megara. Ibycus does a similar thing in one of his pieces to Polycrates. We also have poets engaging with one another. So one of Solon's sort of Sympotic verses responds to a poem by another poet, Mimnermus, where he says, it seems to have been like advice on like what is a good age to reach. Because Mimnermus has some of the poems that belabor old age. And Solon responds and says, no, don't say this. Say that it should be 80. Right? So we do have them kind of some back and forth and some attempts to like get the name in. But more seem to just go for presenting standard values that will have long-term use. So poets naming themselves is quite rare. It's Theognis and Thucydides, and then a few others.
Right. We have a second question from Christian Lehman. Actually, it's a similar. I had this written down as one of my questions as well, so I'm curious about the answer. Were your images just for entertainment? Often part of it. Were they just for entertainment, or were they to provoke the idea that your poetic fiction of sameness extends to visual representation and the repetition of Sympotic scenes? And I was struck by the same thing. It suddenly occurred to me how much repetition there is on this pottery.
Yeah, it's the words and the scenes on so the words being spoken, the scenes on the kylikes, the kylikes, the cups, and the critters, they very much reinforce one another. And there a lot of Sympotic poetry or pottery has Sympotic scenes on it where everyone is engaged in the same action. And so Fiona Hobden talks about this in her book, but you have this like multi-sensory reinforcement of the Sympotic group where you're looking at images of people drinking, you're looking at other people drinking, you're hearing people talking about drinking, and you're like, oh, well, I guess I should be drinking. And this just reinforces the idea of the group as a self. So yeah, it's it's going for good images, but also images that show that it's not just the words reinforcing these ideas of groups, that it's sort of being reinforced by everything that's going on in the symposium.
Is it the worst peer pressure group ever, right? Like everything is telling you, join in, one of us, one of us, one of us.
Yeah, there's no bad peer pressure in Sympotic poetry.
What about the eyes on Sympotic pottery? What do you make of, I mean, I know people say apotropaic symbols, but do you think they're also part of this sort of, I don't know, visual sort of rhetoric?
Yeah, it's, I think, I think they might be. It's, you see like when people put the eye cups up and you've got this like round foot and then the eyes above it, it's, they're very mask-like, and it's like, I'm still watching you, right? So I guess it's kind of, yeah, kind of that sense of, you better still be doing the thing because I'm watching you. But I don't know, it's they're an interesting item.
Yeah, mask-like is a good description. Yeah. We have a last question, I think, here, unless people can add some more if they still have them. But last question for now from Thomas Coward. Hi, Jessica. So thank you for your paper. And then 2 questions. So
All right.
I'm going to read one and then let you answer and then read a second one. So could we compare the rhetorical strategies of group identity and elite behavior in monodic and Sympotic poetry with the contemporaneous Hesiodic catalog of women, another fragmentary text for those who aren't aware, which may have been performed in symposia as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is also much easier than conferences when you get both questions at the same time and you have to remember one while you're answering the first.
They're also written down here, so even better.
Yeah, super, that's much easier. So yeah, I think we can. Now, the Hesiodic catalog of women is a difficult text because it is so fragmentary, and but one of the things that it is doing is it's giving a shared history to the Greeks as a whole, right? It's giving them a mythic genealogy that goes all the way back to the flood and somehow manages to shoehorn everybody in there. Right? So it is giving them a super level of sameness based in a long-term mythic history that is being recounted by the poet. And the inclusion of mythic stories in the Hesiodic catalog of women to link the groups to one another and to explain who everybody is helps this, because it makes what was likely at the time regionalness the property of the Greeks as a whole. So it's taking the regional and making it pan-Hellenic. And so it's operating on a higher level, right? A lot of the strategies in the symposium can operate on that level, but in the moment, they operate on a much lower level. So yeah, so we have that going on with the Hesiodic catalog.
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. Yeah, that's interesting. Oh yeah, second part of Thomas's question. That's right. On group identity, do we find any differences or change of emphasis between the biographical traditions of a poet and the extant fragments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for most poets that have a biographical tradition attached to them, no. Because the tradition seems to have been based off of the fragments. And so for Solon, for example, right, his kind of persona as this moderate politician very much goes from poetry to biographical tradition. And the biographical tradition adds a whole lot about the early days of Solon that we don't get from the poems, but it's in the same vein, right? So it sort of is built to reinforce what we see in the poetry. And this is the same with Alcaeus and with Theognis. The one major exception that comes to mind is Tyrtaeus. And that is because we get a couple of different traditions with him. One where he's a Spartan from the beginning, and the other is when he's and actually this goes back to perhaps one of the earlier questions on physical impairment and disability in lyric. So the biographical tradition for Tyrtaeus that comes out of Athens in the 4th century is that Tyrtaeus was a lame schoolmaster. He was Athenian, and when the Athenians received an oracle when the Spartans received an oracle to ask help from the Athenians in the war against Messenia, the Athenians were like, well, we don't really want to help Sparta, but we also don't want to disobey Apollo. And so they sent Tyrtaeus, who was a lame schoolmaster, thinking, what's he going to do? But of course, the joke's on them because he goes off and inspires the Spartans to be manly, to go off and fight, and Sparta wins its war. So that tradition is at odds with Tyrtaeus presenting himself as an experience, or presenting his speaking eye as an experienced fighter. And in his public elegy, also called Eunomia, fragment 2 and 4, he talks about himself as a Spartan. He is part of the Dorian we. Now, of course, poetic I's and we's are always, iffy. But Tyrtaeus is certainly presenting himself as a Spartan, and the Athenian biographical tradition about him goes contra to this.
It's a good question to sort of end on, because it really highlights the sort of difficulties of this corpus that you're working with. Not only the fragmentary corpus itself that we've touched on, but that the reception of it creates the biographies of the poets that we'd like to know about, but it turns out it's just a lot from their poetry, or is it? And it's so tricky to as you were just saying, pointing out, it's so tricky to tease this out and see what we can get from that tradition.
Yeah.
Maybe I just ask one last question before we give Jessica a break. So our series is New Directions in Classics, and we're aiming to sort of also show kind of public scholarship. What's the relevance of classics today? And as you were going through, especially the sort of rhetorical strategies in archaic lyric, it was striking to me, at least, the ramifications that some of these may have today on things like social media, which sort of operates a lot in an inclusive, exclusive outgroup, cliques in high school, or at least in the high school that's depicted in movies and television, not necessarily everyone's experience, and even in sort of like extreme politics, which we've seen on display across the world in the last couple of years. So I just wondered if you've thought, as someone who's worked on and thought a lot about the rhetoric of inclusion, exclusion, group identity, and so on, do you see ramifications for this, for your research into the broader world of how group identities are still being created? Is this still the way that group identities work, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. It's one of the things that really struck me going through this very diverse corpus of poetry was, there's 5 basic strategies, and it's strategies that we still use today, right? We still address people in ways, in specific ways, to try and get them to behave in a certain way. These are incredibly popular in like scholarly literature and public addresses because it immediately positively disposes your audience towards you. Right? People are more willing to believe you if you say things like, we see this to be the case. And they're like, oh yeah, I believe you there. So yeah, these are definitely still approaches that we see used. One of the bits from modern political oratory that really stuck with me when I was working on Solon's poetry and writing that chapter was a bit from one of Barack Obama's presidential debates from his first run for the US presidency, where he comments on helping America become as good as its promise, right? And this idea of like, we have a great image of who we are, like, and we can meet that. That was what Solon was giving the Athenians. Right? I think that's really why he's their great lawgiver. It's not because his laws worked, right? There's civil strife after Solon for a good 40 years. But it's because he offers them an image of Athens as a great city. And that's what political leaders always do, right? So these strategies are ancient, right? They are how we relate to each other as individuals, as groups, how we define ourselves, and we still use them. And one of the things that struck me in the symposium was how much these strategies stress similarity. Outgroups are very rare compared to everything else. And there seems to be a, it's almost like there's a force that is insisting on finding something positive and similar that links the group. And, you know, there's something kind of inspiring about that, to say there, you know, there could be like bad, like awful things going on around us, but in this space, we are safe and we are the same, and we are going to enjoy this moment. There's a lot of raucous and ridiculous things that come out of the symposium. But I think, you know, looking at this as a way of, you know, stressing similarity and shared beliefs in humanity is also something unique that, you know, we should focus on as well.
Great, thank you very much, and great note to end things on. So before we thank Jessica, I'll just remind audience members, if you're interested, we still have one talk left in our Zoom conversation series. It's coming up in 3 weeks' time on March 26th, when Professor Michael McKinnon of the University of Winnipeg will give, will join us in conversation, I should say, with the topic Reconstructing Cats and Dogs from Animal Remains from Antiquity. So pet lovers, or since their remains, pet haters, should come as well. But for now, and I'm going to try and get them all, we ought to, all of us ought to thank Jessica for the talk we just heard, and anyone who doesn't would be just completely wrong. So thanks very much, Jessica, for a wonderful talk and for joining us in conversation and for answering these questions and providing so much food for thought going forward. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for coming.
Well, thank you for having me, and for everyone who came and asked questions.
Great. And thanks very much to the audience as well.